Hello and welcome to the 10th video in this series looking at making a space shooter game using some HTML and JavaScript. So this is the first of two videos that begin with chapter 10 because they all involve the same thing, and that's the enemies, but I've split it into two videos to make it a little bit, each video a little bit shorter, because particularly with the enemy class there's quite a bit to do. When I've just got the sort of finished game up here on the screen very quick, I'm just going to show you something that happens with the enemies. You'll see as the enemies come on the screen, they're following a certain path. These have come and they've kind of cascaded down the screen, and now we've got some others following the same paths but in a different order. And now we've got some more on the screen here, again following a similar path but going back up the screen. And then we've got one that's gone diagonally across the screen. And what these are doing, and now we've got some going up the screen but in pairs, so there are pairs of them here. What these enemies are all doing, they're all following set patterns which have been predefined as what I've called waypoints in the code for the application. So how do these waypoints work? Well, I've got a little schematic here. Let's imagine we've got one of the enemies that comes later in the game, but I'll just move this out of the way because it's forcing me to select it. If I have an enemy that I say want to come down the left-hand side of the screen, go across the middle and off to the right-hand side here, then that enemy has three distinct waypoints for me. One is its starting position, which has to be a certain X, and a Y that's minus, that's off the screen. It'll stay at the same X and go to another Y point, and stay at the same Y and then go to an X point that's off the screen here. What the player will see is the enemy coming on the screen and then moving off the screen like this. And this is what you just saw in the example of me playing the finished game. And that there is called a set of waypoints. Not only that, but the way the enemies will be set up is they will be set up in so-called sequences. So for me, a sequence is, for example, we have a waypoint that goes just down the left-hand side of the screen here, and I want three enemies to appear in a batch close together. That would be a sequence of three enemies that have been assigned the waypoints to go from the top to the bottom here, and there are three of them. And when I assign that sequence, I need to assign a number of things. I need to assign where it starts, which is off the screen, where it ends, and any points to turn in the middle of that sequence. And because I'm going to have more than one sequence of enemies, I need to also be able to assign a gap to wait between sequences, otherwise they'll sit on top of each other. And I also need to assign a gap between the enemies themselves. So, for example, if I have two sequences of three enemies, the first sequence has the enemies going down and across the screen and off here, and three of them. And the next sequence has enemies going down the right-hand side of the screen and three of them. I want probably a bit of a gap of maybe 4 or 5 seconds before the second sequence runs to allow the first lot of enemies to get off the screen. But the three enemies in this sequence going down the right-hand side of the screen, the gap between them is going to be very short to keep them all close together, so they appear quite short. So if I just make a couple of copies of these enemies here, and we have three, as they would appear on the screen and scroll down the screen like this, the gap between them as they get created has to be very short to keep them close together. So I need to think about the delay between whole sequences, and I need to think about the gap between them as well. The other thing I need to consider is how many bullets need to hit them for them to die, and how many points we'll score for killing them, because we can vary this for each sequence of enemies. The other thing I'd like to be able to specify is the speed. I'd like some batches to run faster than others. And that's what I want to set up now. Also the image of the enemy as well. I'd like to set up all of the preparation of the sequences that our enemies are going to follow, and in the following video we'll set up the enemy class and everything. So hopefully that's clear. It's probably not, but hopefully it's a little bit clear, and when we do the code it should become a little bit more clear. As a bit of setup, I've already put in the assets and enemies folder with one enemy PNG. We'll add all the rest in at the end of the series. We just need one for now to play around with it. I've added enemy.js already, and in defs.js at the top I've already added the link to the description of the enemy file, and in index.html I've added enemy.js just below bullet.js, and we're ready to go with the enemy sequences. So the first thing to do then is to put these waypoints in that I was talking about. So this is going to be an object with some keys, and here I have waypoints. So I have an object here with some keys. The first one is called left to right shallow. The next one is called stream from 180. I'll just log one of these to the console in the browser. So I have my waypoints object, and when I want to access a list of particular waypoints, I just need to use the key I've defined to access that list. Let's have a look at that. So I refresh here and you can see waypoints left to right shallow. I've got a list of 3. And then each of those 3, the first one is to start at x is 60, y is minus 90. So in other words, try and delete some of these here. In other words, x is 60 minus 90, it's about here. And then the second waypoint is to go to x is 60, y is 128. In other words, go down the screen a bit. And then the final waypoint is x is 810 and y stays at 128. So in other words, we go all the way across the right hand of the screen and off. So that's a set of waypoints like this. And then we have one here. It's coming from the bottom at 180x, going from y is 620 off the bottom to y is minus 90 off the top of the screen. The other thing we have then in the waypoints is a direction. That could be calculated from the x and the y's and the other waypoints, but for my purposes it was just simpler just to type it in here. And I've got rotation in there as well, which we won't use in the series, but when I originally started making this, I kind of thought it might be nice in the future if I wanted to add to the game a bit to have the ships and the enemies rotating properly according to the direction they were going in. But for now and for the rest of the series, we won't actually use these. So I'll take this log out of here because we won't be needing it anymore. And what I'll have then is a list which is going to hold all of my enemy sequences for the game. Now you remember I described a sequence as a set of enemies. It could be 1, it could be 10, that all follow a set of waypoints in a line of them, as we saw in the demo, across the screen in some kind of way. And it's these sequences that we're going to set up now inside enemy.js. So I'm going to write a function to do this, and I'm going to make myself some space. And I'm going to call this add enemy sequence. And this is going to take in a few arguments. And I've pasted these in, and of course the code's on GitHub. Feel free to paste it as well. I'm really reluctant to make a video last 30 minutes of me typing and making mistakes typing of loads of arguments. It's better to explain what's going on. So as I said before, back on the, if I go back to the slide here and just, will it let me undo a little bit? Yes, it will, good. So an enemy sequence then would be a set of waypoints, and then I've got 3 here in my sequence. So imagine we're adding this sequence. The delay before would be how long do we wait before adding this sequence? And that's to make the gap to make sure that the enemies on the previous sequence have maybe gone off the screen or at least progressed far enough that we don't end up with a mess of enemies all overlapping each other. Image is simply the image we want to use for our enemy. We'll add more enemy images in right at the end of the series. We'll just take the one for now. The score is how many points we score killing one of these enemies in this sequence. The lives is the number of lives the enemy has, so how many bullets effectively need to hit it for it to die. It's mostly 1, but obviously it's changeable. The speed, so they're going to have different speeds, the enemies. The number in this sequence. So in other words, in this sequence here, say they go down the screen, like so. That would be a sequence with a number of 3. Then we have a delay between. That's the amount of time as they're created, the enemies in the sequence, between them. That's usually very short to keep them close together. And then the waypoints is the list of waypoints of which we've defined here with each of the keys. So it could be left to right shallow or stream from B180 in our case, that the enemies are then going to follow. And what I want to do is create a sequence and then add it to our list of enemy sequences here that we can then use to assign to our enemies later on. We need to do a tiny bit of logic, so we're going to loop through all of the enemies we're going to add. And what we need to know is the delay before adding this particular enemy onto the screen. If it's the first enemy, so i.e. number 0, I equals 0, then we'll want to have our delay, the delay before setting, because this enemy has to wait a while to let the previous sequence of enemies disappear off the screen. However, if it's one of the others in the sequence, then they'll have the much shorter delay, which is this delay between. So we'll set up a delay variable that's set to delay between, and then if I is 0, then the delay before is the actual delay we want in time before adding this enemy. And now all that remains is to push an object into our enemy sequences. And this is what our enemy sequences object then looks like. So we have our delay before, it should be added, its image, its waypoints it should follow, its score, its lives, and its speed. And when an enemy is created, it will be assigned or created by assigning these various values. The last thing to do then is set up a function that actually calls add sequence and adds these sequences in. So I'm going to make a function called setup sequences. And in here I'm just going to paste in a couple of sequences I've already created. And here I have then two sequences that I've created to have my enemies appear and move across the screen. I'll just log those to the console so we can see them for now. And we can have a look at the data that we have. Before I do that though, I need to actually make a call to this function, so I'll just drop it down here for now. Later on we'll put it inside main, and let's go to the browser. Sorry, before going to the browser, of course I need to explain what we've got here. So we've got a sequence here where we say we want to wait 2 seconds before we add any enemies. Then we're saying make the enemy the image enemy red 1, 100 points for killing it, 1 bullet to kill it, its speed is 200 over 1000. We're going to add 2 enemies in this sequence. The delay between the enemies will be 800 milliseconds, and they should follow this list of waypoints. Then we'll add another sequence saying wait 4 seconds after this sequence has started. Then same image, same score and lives, slower enemy. Add 6 of them this time. Because they're slower, add a smaller delay between adding them so they stay close together, and have them take the other sequence of waypoints. So going to the browser then to have a quick look. At the top of the browser here, let's see what we have. So we now have our 8 enemies created, which are the 2 plus the 6. The first enemy then will come on the screen after 2000 seconds. 2000 milliseconds, sorry. It'll have this image, 1 life, and a speed of 0.2, and it'll be following these 3 waypoints here. Then the next enemy will be coming after 800 milliseconds, so quite quickly, and again we'll be following the same waypoints as the previous one because they both belong to the same sequence. And now the next one belongs to the next sequence, so we're going to have a 4-second wait, 4000 milliseconds. There's the speed of 0.4, the new speed, and now following just the 2 waypoints because this enemy's been assigned waypoints, a different set of waypoints. And now we get the remaining 5, where there's a much smaller delay of 400 milliseconds, so they stay close together, again following the same set of waypoints. The last thing then to do to be slightly cleaner is just to take this setup sequences, cut it out of here, and drop it into the reset. I won't drop it in the reset game, we'll drop it right here, straight after the settings. Just paste in here to set up all of our sequences so they're ready to go. And we'll keep these sequences then for the rest of the series, and what you'll get from me is some code where we can set up all of the sequences needed for the whole of the game. You don't need to do all of that because there's quite a bit of it. But hopefully that's fairly clear what we're going to be doing, because in the next video we'll actually set up the enemy class and let the enemy then read in his waypoints and then follow his waypoints across the game board. So hopefully that video was clear. Any questions or comments, feel free below the video. Otherwise, thank you very, very much for watching, and see you in the next one.